It's OPB Politics Now for Friday, August 25th. I'm going to start out this podcast stating the obvious. The city of Portland is not doing well. Everywhere you look, there are signs of people struggling. The housing crisis is dragging on. Downtown still does not feel safe. People are fleeing the state's biggest city. And now, Portland's problems are the entire state's problems. Today, we're going to chat about the latest effort to help Portland and whether the politics swirling around reviving the City of Roses will help or hurt its recovery. I'm OPB Politics reporter Lauren Dake.
And I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
Dirk, the governor formed a task force to address the many problems facing the city. The task force met behind closed doors in a downtown high-rise this week. And then the governor came out after the meeting and talked to the press. What did she say?
Right. Yeah, Kotek spoke alongside Dan McMillan. He's the head of a Portland insurance company, The Standard. And like you mentioned, Lauren, they have closed off these meetings to the public and the press because they say they don't want to scare anyone from having frank conversations. But Kotek and McMillan did offer a synopsis of what was said. I think probably the main thing that happened at this first meeting is task force members got a presentation about the very serious challenges that Portland faces. An economist with the firm Eco Northwest walked the group through a series of slides that I have to say are not very inspiring. They show, for instance, that Portland's population is in decline, while cities like Austin or Indianapolis or Nashville, cities he called peer regions, have bounced back from the pandemic and are growing. In fact, Portland is losing population at a faster clip than most of the largest cities in the U.S. That's obviously not good. The presentation also showed how outmigration is helping sap the city of its income tax base, how foot traffic downtown, which had been increasing after the pandemic, has stalled. Shootings are up, taxes are high, office buildings are increasingly vacant. I mean, these are things that cities around the country are facing. We are not unique, but Portland in some cases is seeing some of the most pronounced examples of those issues. And so the task force's job is to figure out some ways to turn the tide and to do it pretty quickly.
So right before the private meeting started, the governor announced who was on the task force. And it's 46 people. 46. That is a lot of people, and they are only meeting 3 times. I have watched a lot of city council meetings, school board meetings, legislative meetings, and I know that when you put that many people in a room, most of whom really like to share their opinion, it can be really challenging to actually get stuff done. Who is on this task force?
Well, you are absolutely right. This does seem challenging. We had been asking for weeks for a roster of the task force members ever since Kotek announced this thing. And they kept saying it was coming, but it never came. And then, as you said, we finally got it the day of the first meeting. And it is fairly massive. This is a list that includes members of Oregon's congressional delegation, think Senator Rod Wyden or Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici, other electeds like Mayor Ted Wheeler, DA Mike Schmidt, County Chair Jessica Vega Peterson. There's some lawmakers on there, but then just dozens of members of Portland's business community, really, including folks from the de facto Chamber of Commerce, small business owners, and members of civic and community groups. You know, how roughly 4 dozen people is going to find consensus on some of these intractable issues, I think remains to be seen. It really does look like Kotek wanted to show she was getting input from a lot of folks.
This roster stood out to a lot of people when it was released as very business heavy, and without some of the housing and homeless service types of people that you might expect to be part of this discussion.
Yeah, so that did stand out to a lot of people because a lot of the well-known players that work most closely with the homeless in the city, names we are well acquainted with, those of us who cover this stuff, were not part of this. And that had some people questioning whether this is a group that's going to put forward proposals that are maybe out of balance, that are business friendly in ways that could lead to responses that some would see as inhumane. Kotek assured reporters that's not going to happen. She says homeless advocates and folks like that will be brought in as part of these discussions as the larger task force breaks up into smaller groups.
Has the governor given a sense of what kind of tangible outcomes that she does expect to come from this?
She has. And let's just be very clear what parts of town this task force is focused on. This is the Central City Task Force. And by that, Kotek means really hard hit areas like downtown or Old Town or the Central East Side that have lost foot traffic, have seen crime spike, but also adjacent areas that maybe aren't as impacted, and maybe are actually doing fine. Things like South Waterfront or the Pearl District. And the group is going to be looking at those areas and also looking at 5 major topics, including public safety, livability, meaning things like trash and graffiti, homelessness, and taxes. And those are going to be subjects that, as I mentioned, 5 subgroups will talk through and bring their recommendations to the main body. Here's how Kotek described the process.
This is not just a big conversation where people just get to vent and study something. This is an opportunity for folks across the city of Portland to come together with action steps in 5 main areas that will then be presented at the Oregon Business Summit in December. So it's a very tight timeline.
And I think she's underselling that a little bit. I mean, we are talking about, as I said, some of the most intractable problems the city faces. She wants to get an action plan done in just 4 months. And one thing the governor did say is she's going to be looking for ways to quantify success. So she wants to see increased foot traffic downtown. She wants to see fewer overdoses. She wants these really important facets of what a downtown is improving. And she's going to be looking for those numbers to get better.
So they're going to meet 3 times. They've already met once. Did you hear from any of the task force members after the first meeting? Did they feel like it was productive?
We did. You know, I think what we heard from the folks we talked to is that this really did feel like table setting. I mean, as I said, they walked through that PowerPoint presentation of the challenges, and then they laid out these subgroups and they started assigning people to these subgroups. And so this was really just, like I said, this was sort of an orientation of sorts. And that in some ways makes it even more striking that this group is only planning on meeting in total 2 more times, because they really didn't start talking about solutions as much in this first meeting.
Are the subgroups going to meet more than 3 times, or are those just 3 times as well?
They are not being very transparent right now about when the subgroups are meeting, even who's on the subgroups, or what that schedule looks like. So that's something we'll be curious about.
Okay, well, we know that the mayor, Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler, came into the meeting with pretty specific requests for the task force. Just give us a sense of what he asked for and whether people were receptive.
Yeah, I mean, I think we touched on this in the podcast before, Lauren. I might be misremembering, but you know, when the governor announced this task force, it was very difficult to see it as anything but sort of a suggestion, and maybe more than that, that Wheeler and other Portland area leaders are not up to the task of fixing this stuff. And in response, I think Wheeler came to Tuesday's meeting prepared. He brought a lengthy list of demands or proposals, or however you want to put it, he wants to see. And generally, these fall under the category that Wheeler is insisting the city cannot grapple with this stuff on its own, that it needs help. To that end, he's asking for, you know, a lot more money from the state, like $250 million, I think, is called out. And then there's even other asks in there. And that's for things like, you know, assisting in clearing homeless camps, or in cleaning the streets of graffiti and trash, of creating an ad campaign to burnish Portland's image, to convert office buildings into housing. The thing that stood out to us most and was the subject of a story we wrote was Wheeler's request for more police. He is asking Kotek to put nearly 100 state troopers to a station in Portland where he'd like them to help respond to crimes, things like persons crimes or theft of property or traffic violations that the city's police force in some cases has kind of thrown its hands up around. I mean, the Portland Police Bureau has continuously complained recently. It just doesn't have the officers to respond to calls for service. So Wheeler is trying to bolster those numbers.
The idea of calling in more law enforcement is interesting because obviously, you know, it comes after this huge movement where the public has suggested we shouldn't be using police officers to serve as mental health responders. And I would guess that the political optics for the governor of calling in more state troopers to patrol the city would not be the best. What do you think the political calculations are here?
As I said, I think Wheeler is partly calling the governor's bluff, sort of saying, you want to solve Portland's problems. Here's what we need. Make it happen. Kotek made clear this week when I asked, she's not ruling anything out. I do think, though, that her putting roughly 100 troopers to Portland is a pretty big stretch. I mean, the Oregon State Police has a chronic vacancy problem of its own, and the number of troopers Wheeler is asking for amounts to about 1/5 of the total troopers that are policing state highways right now. So that's a big piece. Notably, Wheeler is also asking for more federal law enforcement in Portland, which I think is pretty certain to get pushback from folks who remember when President Trump sent in Homeland Security officers in 2020 to essentially do battle with people downtown. We've already heard, predictably, criticisms from this kind of approach from people who scrutinize policing in Portland. We've also heard from some officials that they think it's a good idea, notably City Commissioner Mingus Mapps, who is planning a run for mayor himself.
There is another big issue here in this conversation that I feel like everyone has been having for at least 3 years now. Dirk, you and I have probably been having this longer. Should workers be forced to come back and work in the office, even though clearly a lot of people who used to work downtown every single day 3 years ago do not want to return? Because there's a lot of vacancies in buildings downtown, and there's clearly a need for more foot traffic. So this is a big issue. What are members of the task force saying about this?
Well, Wheeler specifically has made returning workers to their offices one of the pillars of his approach. He's reasoning that more people downtown will help restore the city to how it looked pre-pandemic. But obviously, as you're saying, Lauren, that is far easier said than done. A lot of the companies downtown are holding off mandating that their employees return because, frankly, they say they would lose workers. And the Oregonian talked to Dan McMillan, the co-chair of this task force, the head of the Standard. He said he would lose workers if they started demanding this because people have gotten used to remote or hybrid work during the pandemic. And many companies found they can operate without demanding people come to the office. So I think that makes it very unlikely that Portland or really any other city returns to that world that existed pre-pandemic. And that's going to be a challenge. I mean, Portland is very office heavy in its downtown core. I think Wheeler is going to keep making this plea. I just am not sure who is going to listen.
So one possible solution that's been floated is converting some of these old office buildings into housing as a way to sort of, revive downtown and be a forward-looking solution. But that also seems like a pretty difficult task.
I think that seems like a very difficult task, partly because, just retrofitting office buildings into living spaces that satisfy building codes is probably hugely expensive, definitely filled with big bureaucratic headaches. But this absolutely is something that Kotek and Wheeler and others will be looking at. Actually, the governor said basically that downtown is going to have to fundamentally change.
The way the Central City was first developed, it's very office heavy, with transit really focused on bringing people into the city. We have to rethink how we've been doing things because the world changed with the pandemic. Portland is going to change with it, and we just need to figure out what those strategies are. And I think it's going to mean a lot more people living downtown, not just working downtown.
So it's clear that's how the governor is thinking. She's not offering a ton of specifics about how exactly we do that, how the state might pave the way for switching some of these buildings over to residential. We are just going to have to kind of wait and see. This is early days in this process.
Well, what's next for the task force? Should we expect real results, or is this performative?
That is an interesting question. I think just looking at this from a very high level, as we've been talking about, a group of almost 50 people trying to find solutions to Portland's greatest challenges in just 4 months probably seems like the kind of thing that is destined to generate some headlines, show that Kotek is listening to businesses and trying to help Portland, and then go nowhere. That's the cynical way to look at it. The governor says that is absolutely not the case. And what we know is the main thing the task force plans is to meet 2 more times, as we've said, and then get an action plan ready for this Oregon Leadership Summit in December. That's this annual gathering. It features a lot of business leaders, a lot of civic leaders, some politicians. But Kotek is also saying she's not content to just wait for December. She said she also wants to take steps before that. And she and her co-chair, Dan McMillan, are talking about quick wins. Here's some of what she's saying.
Let's look at the money we have. Can we use it differently? Can we do things differently right now to improve things? Because when you see progress, when you see success, I think you get more progress, more success.
And so, as we've been saying this whole podcast, we are waiting to hear what that progress and success looks like. This is in some ways not very satisfying because we are at the outset of this, but Kotek told people to stay tuned.
Okay, well, we will do that. Let's stay tuned. Dirk, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Lauren.
This week's episode was produced by Andrew Thien. Our audio engineer is Stephen Cray. Our music comes from Audio Network. We will be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening.